The metallic click of handcuffs echoed across the courthouse plaza, cutting through the afternoon heat like a gunshot. Devin Matthews, 17 years old and confined to his wheelchair since birth, stared up at Officer Karen Henderson with a mixture of confusion and growing fear as she secured the restraints around his thin wrists. "You're under arrest for loitering and obstructing a public walkway," Henderson announced, her voice carrying across the concrete steps where a small crowd had begun to gather. The badge on her chest caught the sunlight, reflecting harsh rays that seemed to blind anyone who dared look directly at her. Devin's voice cracked as he spoke, the words tumbling out in a rush of panic. "I'm just waiting for my mom. She's in a meeting inside. I wasn't doing anything wrong." The courthouse steps, normally a place of quiet dignity where justice was supposed to be served, had become a theater of absurdity. Devin had been sitting in the same spot for 45 minutes, his electric wheelchair positioned carefully to one side of the main walkway, his backpack containing his summer reading assignments resting in his lap. He'd been accepted to Howard University on a full scholarship, his future bright with possibility, until this moment when everything began to unravel. Henderson's face remained impassive, her jaw set in a hard line that spoke of years of bureaucratic indifference. She was a woman who had built her career on following rules to the letter, never questioning whether those rules made sense or served justice. At 43, she had accumulated more citizen complaints than any other officer in the department. Yet somehow she remained untouchable, protected by a system that valued conformity over compassion. "The law is the law," she replied, adjusting her utility belt with unnecessary force. "You're blocking pedestrian traffic. I've had multiple complaints about you sitting here." The lie hung in the air like smoke from a fire. There had been no complaints, no traffic blocked, no law broken. But Henderson had seen Devin sitting quietly in his wheelchair, reading a book, and something about the sight had triggered her need to assert authority over someone she perceived as powerless. Margaret Chen, a local news reporter who happened to be leaving the courthouse after covering a municipal hearing, stopped dead in her tracks when she witnessed the scene unfolding. Her journalistic instincts kicked in immediately, and she began recording on her phone, her hands trembling slightly as she captured the injustice playing out before her eyes. "This is Margaret Chen with Channel 7 News, and I'm witnessing what appears to be the unlawful detention of a disabled teenager outside the downtown courthouse. The young man appears to be doing nothing more than waiting, yet he's been placed in handcuffs by Officer Henderson of the City Police Department." Other passers-by began to take notice. Dr. James Williams, a civil rights attorney who had been exiting the building after filing papers in a discrimination case, approached cautiously. His years of experience had taught him to document everything, and he immediately began taking photographs while speaking in calm, measured tones. "Officer, can you please explain what law this young man has violated? I've been observing, and he appears to be sitting peacefully in a location that doesn't impede foot traffic." Henderson's face flushed red, the color creeping up her neck like rising floodwater. She wasn't accustomed to being questioned, especially not by educated professionals who knew their rights. Her hand moved instinctively to her radio, ready to call for backup against what she perceived as a growing threat to her authority. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back. This is an active arrest situation, and your interference is not welcome." But Dr. Williams had dealt with bullies in uniform before. He maintained his position, his voice steady and professional despite the tension crackling in the air around them. "I'm not interfering. I'm observing a public servant conduct official business in a public space. That's my right as a citizen." The crowd was growing larger now, drawn by the commotion and the sight of a teenager in a wheelchair being treated like a criminal. Maria Santos, a social worker who specialized in disability rights, pushed through the gathered people, her face pale with horror at what she was witnessing. "This is outrageous. You can't arrest someone for existing in a public space. This young man has done nothing wrong." Henderson's temper was beginning to fray like a rope under too much tension. She had expected this to be a simple power play, a way to assert her authority over someone she saw as defenseless. Instead, she found herself surrounded by witnesses, cameras, and people who weren't afraid to speak up. "All of you need to disperse immediately, or you'll be arrested for interfering with a police officer." The threat only served to galvanize the crowd further. David Kim, a college student who had been studying for his law school entrance exam in the courthouse library, stepped forward with his phone held high, live streaming the entire encounter to his social media followers. "We're not going anywhere. This is America, and we have the right to observe public officials doing their jobs. What you're doing here is wrong, and everyone can see it." Inside the courthouse, Attorney Victoria Matthews was wrapping up a crucial meeting about new city policies regarding accessibility and public accommodations. As the city's chief legal counsel, she had spent the morning negotiating with federal officials about bringing the municipality into compliance with updated ADA requirements. She had no idea that her son was outside being subjected to the exact kind of discrimination she had dedicated her career to fighting. Victoria had built her reputation on being thorough, fair, and absolutely uncompromising when it came to civil rights. She had prosecuted police misconduct cases, fought for disability rights, and worked tirelessly to make her city a place where everyone could live with dignity. Her office walls were covered with awards and commendations from civil rights organizations. But none of that mattered now, as she remained unaware of the crisis unfolding just outside the building. Back on the courthouse steps, Devin's anxiety was mounting. The handcuffs were cutting into his wrists, and the weight of the situation was beginning to sink in. He thought about his acceptance letter to Howard University, carefully framed on his bedroom wall. He thought about his mother, who had always taught him that education and hard work would protect him from exactly this kind of treatment. He thought about all the times she had told him that things were getting better, that the world was becoming more just. "Please, officer, I really haven't done anything wrong. My mom is Victoria Matthews. She's the city attorney. She's in a meeting upstairs. You can call her if you want." Henderson's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. She knew that name, knew the reputation that came with it. Victoria Matthews was not someone you wanted to cross, especially not when it came to civil rights issues. But Henderson had gone too far to back down now, her pride and stubbornness overriding her better judgment. "I don't care who your mother is. Rich kids don't get special treatment from me." The crowd let out a collective gasp at the officer's words. Margaret Chen, still recording, made sure to capture every word, knowing that this statement alone would be enough to end Henderson's career. "Doctor," Williams shook his head in disbelief. "This is exactly the kind of thinking that leads to civil rights violations. You're not enforcing the law. Officer, you're abusing your power." The tension on the courthouse steps was reaching a breaking point. More people had gathered, creating a semicircle around the scene. Some were recording on their phones, others were calling local news stations, and a few were already posting updates on social media. The hashtag #Justice for Devin was beginning to trend locally, and the story was spreading faster than Henderson could contain it. Sarah Thompson, a disability rights advocate who had been attending a different hearing in the courthouse, emerged from the building to find the crowd. When she saw what was happening, she immediately began making phone calls to every civil rights organization she knew. "This is Sarah Thompson with Disability Rights Alliance. I need you to get a legal team down to the courthouse immediately. We have a young man with disabilities being unlawfully detained by city police." Henderson could feel the situation spiraling out of control. She had expected quick compliance, a simple arrest that would be forgotten by everyone within hours. Instead, she found herself at the center of a growing civil rights incident that was being documented from every angle. Everyone needs to step back now. This is your final warning. But the crowd wasn't budging. They had seen too much, witnessed too clear an injustice to simply walk away. The energy in the air was electric, charged with the kind of righteous anger that sparks movements and changes history. Father Michael O'Brien, who had been visiting the courthouse to inquire about permits for a community outreach program, approached with his collar clearly visible. His presence added another layer of moral authority to the growing coalition of witnesses. "Officer, I've been ministering to this community for 20 years. I know injustice when I see it, and what you're doing to this young man is wrong. In the name of basic human decency, I'm asking you to release him." Henderson's radio crackled to life, dispatch trying to reach her for a routine check-in. She ignored it, too focused on the crowd that seemed to be growing by the minute. Every face looking at her was filled with condemnation. Every phone pointed in her direction was capturing evidence of her misconduct. Inside the courthouse, Victoria Matthews was finally gathering her papers, preparing to leave the meeting that had run longer than expected. She glanced at her watch, realizing that Devin had been waiting for over an hour. She felt a pang of guilt, knowing how much her son disliked being kept waiting, especially in public places where his disability made him feel conspicuous. As she made her way toward the elevator, one of the courthouse security guards approached her with a worried expression. "Ms. Matthews, I think you need to know that there's some kind of situation outside involving a young man in a wheelchair. The crowd's getting pretty big." Victoria's blood ran cold. She didn't need to ask for details. She knew instinctively that the young man was her son. She had spent years fighting against exactly this kind of discrimination, had seen too many cases where disabled individuals were targeted by overzealous law enforcement. The irony that it was happening to her own child, outside the very building where she worked to prevent such injustices, was not lost on her. She ran to the nearest window that overlooked the courthouse steps, her heart pounding as she saw the crowd gathered below. Even from the third floor, she could see Devin's wheelchair, could see the officer standing over him, could see the handcuffs glinting in the sunlight. Victoria had prosecuted dozens of civil rights cases, had stood in courtrooms arguing for justice and equality. But seeing her own son being treated like a criminal unleashed a fury she had never experienced before. This wasn't just about law and policy anymore. This was about her child, about the young man she had raised to believe in the promise of America. She ran toward the elevator, her heels clicking against the marble floor with military precision. Other courthouse employees watched her go, recognizing the look of absolute determination on her face. Victoria Matthews was about to go to war, and everyone who knew her understood that when she fought, she won. Outside, the crowd had grown to more than 50 people. News vans were beginning to arrive, their satellite dishes extending toward the sky like metallic flowers reaching for the sun. The story had caught fire on social media, with videos of the incident being shared thousands of times within minutes. Henderson was now visibly sweating, her uniform clinging to her back as she realized the magnitude of what she had started. She had wanted to flex her authority over what she perceived as an easy target, but instead, she had created a public relations nightmare that would follow her for the rest of her career. Devin, meanwhile, was trying to stay calm despite the chaos swirling around him. He had learned from his mother's example that dignity in the face of injustice was its own form of resistance. He sat straighter in his wheelchair, his chin raised slightly, refusing to let Henderson's actions diminish his sense of self-worth. "I'm not going to resist or cause trouble, but I want everyone to know that I was just sitting here reading, waiting for my mom. I wasn't breaking any laws." His words carried clearly across the courthouse steps, recorded by dozens of phones and cameras. The calm dignity in his voice stood in stark contrast to Henderson's increasingly frantic behavior, and the crowd responded with murmurs of support and encouragement. Margaret Chen had called her news director, and within minutes, a full news crew was dispatched to the courthouse. This was the kind of story that could define a career, the kind of injustice that demanded exposure and accountability. The courthouse doors burst open with a force that made several people in the crowd jump. Victoria Matthews emerged like a force of nature, her expression fierce with maternal rage and professional outrage. She took in the scene with a single glance, her son in handcuffs, the officer standing over him, the crowd of witnesses documenting everything. For a moment, the entire courthouse steps fell silent. Even Henderson seemed to recognize that something fundamental had changed in the dynamic of the situation. Victoria Matthews was not just any angry parent. She was the city's chief legal counsel, a woman with the power to make careers and destroy them with equal efficiency. "Officer Henderson, I am Victoria Matthews, chief legal counsel for this city. The young man you have unlawfully detained is my son. I demand that you release him immediately." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms, who had stared down federal judges and negotiated with senators. Every word was carefully chosen, every syllable designed to convey the full weight of her professional standing. Henderson's face went pale as the full implications of the situation hit her. She had not just arrested a random disabled teenager. She had arrested the son of the woman who could effectively end her career with a single phone call. The handcuffs suddenly felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. "Ms. Matthews, your son was loitering and blocking the sidewalk. I was just enforcing city ordinances." Victoria's laugh was sharp and bitter, cutting through the air like a blade. "Officer Henderson, I wrote those ordinances. I know every word, every clause, every exception. My son was sitting peacefully in a location that does not impede foot traffic, engaging in no illegal activity. What you have done is not law enforcement. It is harassment based on disability status." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Dr. Williams stepped forward, his own legal training evident in his posture and tone. "Ms. Matthews, I'm Dr. James Williams, and I've been documenting this entire incident. This officer has violated several federal and state laws, including the Americans with Disabilities Act and basic civil rights protections." Victoria nodded grimly, her mind already working through the legal implications of what she was witnessing. "Doctor, I would very much appreciate if you could provide me with copies of any documentation you've gathered. This incident will be thoroughly investigated." Henderson finally seemed to realize the gravity of her situation. She reached for her keys, her hands shaking slightly as she moved to unlock the handcuffs. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding. I'm going to release your son now." "No, Officer Henderson, there was no misunderstanding. There was a deliberate violation of my son's civil rights, captured on video by multiple witnesses. The handcuffs coming off now doesn't erase what you've done." Victoria moved to her son's side, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder as Henderson removed the restraints. She could see the red marks on Devin's wrists, the evidence of how tightly the handcuffs had been applied, and her anger intensified. "Are you hurt, sweetheart?" Devin rubbed his wrists, trying to restore circulation to his hands. "I'm okay, Mom, but I don't understand why this happened. I was just sitting here like you told me to." The pain in his voice was evident. Not physical pain, but the deeper hurt of someone who had been singled out for treatment he didn't deserve. Victoria's heart broke for her son, but her professional training kicked in immediately. "Officer Henderson, I want your badge number and the incident report number for this arrest. I also want the names and badge numbers of any other officers who were called to the scene." Henderson's responses were mumbled and defensive. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated. She had gone from predator to prey in the span of minutes, and everyone watching could see the transformation. Margaret Chen approached with her camera crew, her reporter's instincts telling her that this story was far from over. "Ms. Matthews, as the city's chief legal counsel, what action will you be taking regarding this incident?" Victoria looked directly into the camera, her expression serious and determined. "This incident represents everything that is wrong with policing in America today. A disabled teenager was criminalized for the act of existing in a public space. This is not just about my son. This is about every person with disabilities who has been marginalized, discriminated against, and treated as less than human by those sworn to protect and serve." The crowd grew quiet, sensing that something important was about to happen. Victoria Matthews was not just angry. She was channeling that anger into something constructive, something that could create lasting change. "I am calling for an immediate investigation into Officer Henderson's conduct, not just today, but throughout her entire career. I am also calling for mandatory training for all city police officers on disability rights and civil rights. And I am announcing that the city will be implementing new protocols to ensure that what happened to my son never happens to anyone else." The applause was thunderous, echoing off the courthouse walls and carrying across the surrounding blocks. This was not just about one incident anymore. It was about systemic change, about using this moment of injustice to create a better future for everyone. Henderson tried to slip away quietly, but Dr. Williams called out to her, "Officer, where are you going? This situation isn't resolved just because you removed the handcuffs." Victoria nodded in agreement. "Officer Henderson, you will be reporting to Internal Affairs first thing Monday morning. Your conduct today has been thoroughly documented, and there will be consequences." The news crews were multiplying, with reporters from every major outlet in the city descending on the courthouse steps. The story was spreading nationally, picked up by civil rights organizations and disability advocacy groups across the country. Sarah Thompson from the Disability Rights Alliance approached Victoria, her expression both sympathetic and determined. "Ms. Matthews, our organization stands ready to support you and your son in any way necessary. This kind of discrimination cannot be tolerated." Victoria shook her hand firmly. "Thank you, Sarah. This is exactly the kind of coalition we need to create real change. One voice can be ignored, but when we all speak together, we cannot be silenced." As the crowd began to disperse, many people approached Devin to offer words of support and encouragement. He was overwhelmed by the kindness of strangers, by the way people had stood up for him without being asked. "I never expected so many people to care about what happened to me. I thought I was just going to have to accept being treated badly." Father O'Brien knelt down to Devin's eye level, his expression kind and understanding. "Son, you should never have to accept being treated badly. What happened today was wrong. But look at how many people stood up for you. That's the real America, the one worth fighting for." As the afternoon wore on, the story continued to gain momentum. Social media was flooded with videos of the incident, with commentary from civil rights leaders, and with calls for accountability. The hashtag #Justice for Devin was trending nationally, and the courthouse steps incident had become a symbol of the ongoing fight for disability rights. Victoria received calls from colleagues across the country, from federal prosecutors and civil rights attorneys who offered their support and expertise. The incident had touched a nerve, reminding everyone that the fight for equality was far from over. That evening, as Victoria and Devin sat in their living room, the weight of the day's events finally began to settle. Devin was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, while Victoria was already planning her next steps in the fight for justice. "Mom, do you think anything will really change because of what happened today?" Victoria looked at her son, seeing not just the teenager who had been wronged, but the young man who had handled himself with dignity and grace under impossible circumstances. "Sweetheart, change doesn't happen overnight. But today, people saw something they couldn't ignore. They saw injustice, and they responded with compassion and courage. That's how change begins." She pulled out her laptop and began drafting a comprehensive proposal for police reform, focusing specifically on training and accountability measures. This would be her gift to the city, her way of ensuring that no other family would have to endure what they had experienced. The next morning, Victoria woke up to find that the story had gone viral overnight. News outlets across the country were reporting on the incident, and civil rights organizations were calling for federal investigations. The courthouse steps, which had been the site of injustice just 24 hours earlier, were now covered with flowers and signs of support left by community members. Officer Henderson did not report to work that morning. She had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation, and her police union had already distanced themselves from her actions. The video evidence was too clear, the witness testimony too consistent, and the public outrage too intense for anyone to defend her behavior. Victoria spent the morning in meetings with city officials, federal prosecutors, and civil rights attorneys. The incident had created an opportunity for systemic change, and she was determined not to let it slip away. She had drafted a comprehensive reform package that included mandatory training, accountability measures, and civilian oversight of police interactions with disabled individuals. The City Council called an emergency session to address the incident and the growing public pressure for reform. Victoria was asked to present her proposals, and she stood before the packed council chambers with the same determination she had shown on the courthouse steps. Members of the council, what happened to my son yesterday was not an isolated incident. It was the predictable result of a system that has failed to protect the rights of our most vulnerable citizens. We have an opportunity today to be leaders, to show the nation what real accountability looks like. The council voted unanimously to implement Victoria's reform package, including mandatory training for all officers, civilian oversight of disability-related incidents, and financial penalties for departments that failed to meet compliance standards. It was a victory that went far beyond what had happened to Devin, creating protections that would benefit thousands of people. Officer Henderson was terminated from the police force after the internal investigation confirmed multiple violations of department policy and federal law. She faced federal civil rights charges, and the incident became a case study in police academies across the country about the importance of treating all citizens with dignity and respect. 6 months later, Devin was preparing to leave for Howard University. His dream of becoming a civil rights lawyer even stronger after his experience on the courthouse steps. He had become an advocate himself, speaking at conferences and working with disability rights organizations to prevent others from experiencing what he had endured. Victoria had been offered positions with several federal agencies, recognition of her work in reforming police practices and protecting civil rights. But she chose to stay in her hometown, continuing to work for the city that had given her family both its worst and best moments. The courthouse steps had been officially renamed the Victoria and Devin Matthews Memorial Plaza, in honor of their fight for justice and equality. A plaque was installed, reading in memory of all who have been denied dignity in public spaces, and in honor of those who stand up for justice. On the day of the dedication ceremony, hundreds of people gathered to celebrate the transformation that had taken place. Dr. Williams, who had documented the original incident, spoke about the power of witnesses to create change. Sarah Thompson talked about the importance of standing together across all lines of difference. Father O'Brien offered a blessing for continued progress toward justice. As Victoria and Devin sat together on the courthouse steps, now surrounded by friends and allies rather than hostile officers, they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had started as an act of cruelty had become a catalyst for change, proof that even in the darkest moments, the light of justice could still shine through. "You know, Mom, I used to be afraid of these steps. Now I see them as a place where something important began." Victoria smiled, watching the crowd of diverse faces gathered to celebrate progress and possibility. "That's exactly right, sweetheart. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the foundation for the best things we do." The sun set over the courthouse plaza, casting long shadows across the steps, where injustice had once occurred and where hope now resided. The fight for equality was far from over. But on this day, in this place, victory belonged to those who had chosen to stand up for what was right. The courthouse steps had become a symbol not of oppression, but of the possibility that exists when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice, and instead choose to create a better world for everyone. As the ceremony ended and people began to disperse, Victoria and Devin remained on the steps for a few more minutes, savoring the moment and the progress it represented. They had turned their pain into purpose, their anger into action, and their experience into a lasting legacy of justice. The courthouse steps would never again be just a place where laws were debated. They had become a place where justice was born. The story of what happened on those steps that day had become part of the city's history, a reminder that change is possible when people refuse to be silent in the face of injustice. It was a story that would be told for generations, inspiring others to stand up, speak out, and fight for the dignity and rights of all people, regardless of their circumstances or challenges. In the end, Officer Henderson's attempt to assert power over someone she perceived as powerless had backfired spectacularly. Her actions had not only ended her own career, but had catalyzed a movement that would protect countless others from the same treatment. The courthouse steps had become a place of transformation, where the worst of human nature had been met by the best, and where justice had ultimately prevailed. The legacy of that day would continue to ripple outward, touching lives and changing systems in ways that no one could have imagined when it all began with a disabled teenager simply waiting for his mother. It was a testament to the power of truth, the importance of witnesses, and the unbreakable strength of those who refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. As Victoria and Devin finally left the courthouse steps that evening, they carried with them not just the memory of what had happened, but the knowledge of what they had accomplished together. They had taken a moment of darkness and transformed it into a beacon of light, proving that even in the face of systemic oppression, justice could still find a way to shine through. The courthouse steps stood empty now, but they were no longer silent. They had become a voice for the voiceless, a symbol of hope for the hopeless, and a reminder that in America, when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things. Justice is not just possible, it is inevitable.